Philip Larkin's poem At Grass seems a straightforward enough poem featuring horses that have been rested from racing. But what I enjoyed about today's programme was its refusal to merely accept the poem at face value. As a poet myself, I'm always looking for that vivid image, which will be simple yet memorable, and that will speak in many ways, like the light sparking in many directions off an emerald. The highest hope for a poem, that the whole will speak as itself, but also in many ways depending on the audience. I continue to learn from the masters, and At Grass is one of those wonderful, multifaceted poems. The programme is beautifully produced by Sarah Davis with the feeling of a sunny Saturday afternoon alongside those dewy Monday mornings out in the fields where horses look out. We feature this episode to remember the great poet Philip Larkin, who died 40 years ago on 2nd of December 1985. Adventures in Poetry, Philip Larkin, At Grass, was first aired on Radio 4 in April 1999. Presented by Stephen Regan. Let's go over now to a racecourse to hear of horses in their heyday.
Now, it's just 5 minutes to 3, and it'll take the horses most of those 5 minutes to get to the start. Try and imagine the course as a great big horseshoe, with most of the famous Derby crowd, tents, sideshows, merry-go-rounds and all, inside the horseshoe. The whole thing set in a wonderful bit of country, half wood and half downland, like a gigantic park. There's a bit of a haze at the moment, but yesterday with the sun shining, it must have been it must have been England at its very best.
At Grass. The eye can hardly pick them out from the cold shade they shelter in, till wind distresses tail and mane. Then one crops grass and moves about, the other seeming to look on, and stands anonymous again. Yet 15 years ago, perhaps 24 distances sufficed to fable them. Faint afternoons of cups and stakes and handicaps, whereby their names were artificed to inlay faded classic dunes. Silks at the start, against the sky numbers and parasols. Outside, squadrons of empty cars, and heat, and littered grass. Then the long cry, hanging unhushed till it subside to stop press columns on the street. Do memories plague their ears like flies? They shake their heads. Dusk brims the shadows. Summer by summer all stole away. The starting gates, the crowds and cries, all but the unmolesting meadows. Almanacked, their names live. They have slipped their names, and stand at ease, or gallop for what must be joy, and not a field glass sees them home, or curious stopwatch prophesies. Only the groom and the groom's boy, with bridles in the evening come.
That was the poet Andrew Motion, who is also Philip Larkin's biographer, reading At Grass, one of the most popular post-war English poems. Its enduring appeal owes much to its vivid description of a summer racecourse, and the quiet aftermath in which famous racehorses live out their closing days. But for many readers, At Grass is not simply a poem about retired racehorses. It's been read as a fable about fame and achievement, about identity and anonymity, and about the short-lived and elusive nature of joy and freedom. It's been seen as a quintessentially English poem, recalling a time of national glory and lamenting the loss of power and prestige that accompanied the end of empire. At Grass was written in January 1950. It was given prominence by Larkin as the closing poem in his first mature collection, The Less Deceived, in 1955. It was widely anthologised in the years that followed. In this programme, we'll be exploring the poem's power to elicit a range of different, often conflicting responses. It appears to have been inspired not by Larkin's first-hand observation of racehorses, but by a documentary film he saw at the cinema, commemorating the death in 1948 of Brown Jack, a hugely popular racehorse of the 1920s and 30s, 7 times Royal Ascot winner. The poet Helen Dunmore responds to the poem's appealing visual quality.
It interests me that Larkin saw film rather than the horse itself, because I think there is that kind of grainy classic feeling about the poem, that slight remove that you get with a film.
The eye can hardly pick them out from the cold shade they shelter in, till wind distresses tail and mane.
And they emerge, they almost are developed. It's like you're seeing them in a bath of developing fluid, and suddenly, yes, they're racehorses, and that's one of them twitching a mane, and one of them moves, one of them goes off and gallops. And I love that quality that as you read the poem, as you watch, it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, comes into sharper and sharper focus, and then it goes away again. So it's a very filmic poem.
Foreign Secretary Robin Cook responds as a lifelong racing enthusiast.
In many ways that does help to explain the poem, which has a lot of contrast between the life and activity of the horse, which took place in the summer sunshine, and now its last days, which are in dusk, in the evening. There is that sense of premonition of passing away in the poem.
However evocative Larkin's picture of racehorses may be, a sharp-eyed enthusiast like Robin Cook or writer and sports journalist Simon Barnes can spot the odd inaccuracy.
It's not exactly pedantry, but it's just something that slightly jars with the lovely horsemanship of most of the poem, is that it seems to me that these are old horses that the grooms are taking away from their play at grass to go and put in their boxes at night. They're not going to be ridden, so you wouldn't actually take a bridle, you'd probably just take a head collar. But maybe I should apologise for that observation.
He does get it wrong. He won't do use of words which would not be used by anybody who actually knew the racing world and had spent time knocking around stables. For instance, I very much doubt if any groom's boy goes out with bridles in the evenings. He'd go out with a halter. That doesn't matter. I mean, what matters is the picture conveyed by the poem and the powerful feeling behind it. The description of the race meetings in summer is very accurate, and anybody who's been there can recognise it. And there's that sense of excitement to the stop-pressed columns on the street, which is true.
They're getting into their right positions. That's the draw. They're coming up. Any minute now, you must listen intently. Any second. I think you get them the first time.
Silks at the start. Against the sky, numbers and parasols. Outside, squadrons of empty cars, and heat, and littered grass. Then the long cry, hanging unhushed till it subside to stop-press columns on the street.
Although the going's hard, the grass isn't dried up, and the course makes a vivid streak of green between the crowds on either side. Right below us on this side is the members' enclosure, men only, and nothing but top hats, grey and black, but mostly grey, or perhaps it is that the grey shows up better. But it's the crowd the other side of the finish that makes this different from any other race I've ever seen. The ground rises a bit there, and it's just covered with people. It's the biggest crowd I've ever seen in my life. And where there aren't people, there are tents of every shape and size. Buses, red, green, light blue, merry-go-rounds, motor cars, rows and rows and rows of them. Sideshows.
If you love it, it's too exciting, and you see the horses coming out and the guys in their silks, and it's a ballet. It's just beautiful. It's a performance.
Signalling the latest news to whoever it may concern.
I love the long cry, hanging unhushed. It's as a favourite's coming storming through to win over the last furlong or so. You can hear the roar rise and travel like a train along the running rails.
The great thing about a big race meeting is there's a complete sensory experience, and you have the vision, the colour of the silks. And if you see a large field, it is an extremely colourful occasion. I mean, they are distinctive, the colours, because so you can see them a mile away and pick them out. But that has a tremendous visual impact. There's the noise. So if you are near the fence, if you're near the finish post, you can hear the hoofs rattle, and you can hear the crowd roar. That very strong sense of colour, of sound, of experience, of being there, vastly, I would say, richer than ever watching it on television, does come across and is neatly contrasted with the empty, quiet field at dusk where the horse is finishing its days.
After the race, the horses are led off and the saddles are undone and horses are being, hosed down and cooled down and then quietly by their groom just going back into their box. And it's just really, oh, well done, old boy, it's just beautiful.
Dusk brims the shadows. Summer by summer all stole away. The starting gates, the crowds and cries, all but the unmolesting meadows. Almanacked, their names live. They have slipped their names, and stand at ease, or gallop for what must be joy.
They have slipped their names. I love the word slipped. It was absolutely perfect, because when you lead a horse, you take him in the head collar, you don't clip or tie anything. You pass the rope through the ring, so you've just got a kind of a U of rope, and you take it in there. And the horse is likely to kick up his heels and go the instant he sees his friend, the instant he sees the grass. He wants to express, he wants to gallop for joy, as the poem very nicely says. And so what you do is you let go one end of the rope, and the rope feeds itself out through the ring of the head collar. You slip the rope. And the idea of the horse slipping his names just evokes that moment of a horse used to into field. Says, right, I'm off, and bang, he's away from humans. He's a horse again. He's having his pick of grass. He's having his play. But he's only troubled about those horsey things about where to stand, where to be cool, where there are fewest flies, where the nicest grass is, and that kind of slipping of cares, slipping of human cares, which is not only a nice thing for horses, it's a nice thing for anybody to be able to do.
It's these lines that prompt Andrew Motion to look more closely at the personal events in Larkin's life at this time, although with some caution.
The relationship between the circumstances of a poem and what's in it need incredibly careful handling, and I think it is worth stressing that, because among the million things that we don't know about art, the one thing that we do know is that it is almost never, in fact never, I think, merely a convulsive expression of personality. In my biography of Larkin, I did try and point out, in a not too constraining way, that there are various other things going on in his life at the time too which might have affected it, particularly the collapse of his really first important love affair with a woman who he was briefly engaged to, even Ruth Bowman. By the time that he seems to have started work on the poem, the heat had gone out of the distress of that relationship, and I think there is a sense in which we can speak about Larkin having slipped not quite his name in order to establish himself as the poet that he, at around this time, really quite quickly became. But he has slipped a sort of name in coming to the point where he can write this poem. And the name that he's slipped is the name of somebody who might become conventionally and more or less happily, unhappily married. In other words, in slipping the name of a certain sort of male middle-class social expectation, he has been able to name himself differently as a solitary, speculative, self-centred, I don't necessarily mean self-centred, though there might be something of that in it, but self-centred individual poet, possibly in the same way that for the horses to get rid of their names, their function, their expected function, being racehorses, allows them to achieve a different identity, which might be less successful in the world's eyes, but is, in its way, joyful, in a way which, that's the key word, isn't it? What might be joy? In a way that their previous existences, for all their successes, at least in terms of the poem, is not named.
At Grass turned out to be a crucial poem in Larkin's developing career. It marked the beginning of a profusely creative period in which he produced some of his most memorable work. At Grass brought to English poetry in the 1950s a new and distinctive voice, slightly reserved, yet relaxed and colloquial, occasionally hesitant, but also intimately engaging. This decisive shift in Larkin's writing owed something to his practice as a novelist. Two novels, Jill and A Girl in Winter, had been published in the 1940s, and Larkin began to apply his skills in narrative technique to the writing of poetry. What also helped to establish a new and distinctive voice was Larkin's association with a group of writers known as the Movement, a group that included Kingsley Amis, Donald Davey, D.J. Enright, Elizabeth Jennings and Iris Murdoch. In opposition to the highly rhetorical, extravagant and often obscure poetry of Dylan Thomas and the so-called neo-romantic poets, the movement promoted a rational, clear-sighted and illusioned style of writing. There were other shaping influences. Although Larkin himself claimed that the potent music of W.B. Yeats gave way in the 1940s to the plain speaking of Thomas Hardy, At Grass has echoes of a specifically English lyrical tradition, which for some critics in the 1950s and 1960s was already outmoded. In 1962, At Grass was included in the controversial Penguin anthology, The New Poetry. The editor, Al Alvarez, compared Larkin's poem unfavourably with A Dream of Horses by Ted Hughes, praising the urgent, intensely psychological writing of Hughes, and rather dismissing Larkin's poem as elegant and unpretentious, and rather beautiful in its gentle way. A later generation of writers and critics reacted strongly to this faint praise.
It seems to be a poem about horses, but it very, very firmly establishes itself, but in a way which is curiously neglected in most accounts of the poem, as being really not to do with the horses at all. I mean, it's much more to do with their social world, I think. It's to do with retirement, it's to do with what happens at the end of the day, with all the associations that phrase has with it, when the groom and the groomsboy come along with their bridles. It's very much not to do with the sort of things that Alvarez seems to want to make it out to be. To do with. I mean, he says that they belong to the world of the RSPCA. Oh, no, they don't. I mean, they're not nearly horsey enough to belong to the RSPCA or any other animal organisation, actually. I mean, they belong in the world of symbols and poetic representations and so on, for all their actuality.
I'm not sure, though, that I would want to go too far into interpreting the poem as a sort of social comment or a comment on times. I think it is much more about making that contrast between achievement, the high spot of career, and then the tranquility of the aftermath, and perhaps the paradox that here you had a horse which was tremendously famous, which probably, like most racehorses, relished the excitement of the race meeting, then ending its days anonymous, having slipped his name and slipped his memories, no longer the centre of that excitement. And the contrast between the excitement of his career and the tranquility of his end runs through the poem from start to finish. I think it plainly has an application beyond the life of the horse. And it's a very human expression and could be applicable to any number of human circumstances where you have had that high summer of success and the peak of career, and then you have hopefully the tranquility of retirement which reflect upon it.
Alongside the experimental modernism of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, At Grass might seem distinctly old-fashioned, but what Larkin managed to achieve with this and later poems was a decisive readjustment of the rhythm and vocabulary of English poetry.
In 1999, we are completely used now to the idea that this way of writing poems, of Larkin's, really has become the common language of poetry for the last 50-odd years. I mean, it nearly is exactly 50 years old, a poem. So what seems to us, as you might say, old hat, we do need to remind ourselves the element of sort of, well, not quite revolutionariness about it, but certainly newness about it.
He's used a lot of devices, quite formal devices, obviously the fairly strict rhyme scheme. And then he uses some alliteration, such as when he says, "Summer by summer all stole away." And you can just see the tiptoeing away of the present. It's a wonderful image that you don't move away from your past, but somehow it tiptoes away. And so I think the thought is very electric and alive, but it's harnessed by this formality and by the rhyme, very successfully, in my view.
At Grass also contains one of the most striking examples of enjambement, a device that takes its name, appropriately enough, from horse riding. It means striding on, and describes the technique whereby words run on from one line to the next. At the point in the poem where the horses slip their names, the line in fact slips to another stanza.
Almanacked, their names live. They have slipped their names, and stand at ease.
The poem is more complex and puzzling than a cursory reading might suggest. Its concern with the processes of naming suggests a preoccupation with questions of identity and position, whilst the strange use of negative prefixes like unhushed and unmolesting seems to complicate its potential meanings.
It isn't quite negative unhushed. I mean, it's, in fact, the agency of their fame, this unhushedness, isn't it? Unmolesting is a different sort of thing altogether, I think, in the sense that, I mean, this is a poem full of sort of rationalism and realism, but whoever realistically suggested that you might get molested by a meadow, and therefore that you might get unmolested by a meadow, I mean, clearly, at that level, it's sort of, as you might say, doesn't quite make sense. But in another sense, of course, it makes a great deal of sense. I mean, as I understand it, these unmolesting meadows are the neutral environment into which, I mean, the neutral context in which these creatures, these horses, have been retired. But I think essentially what it does is to think that it's a word which puts into our mind ideas which, even as it seems to cancel them, are reaffirmed or prolonged in some way.
In the poem's only simile, do memories plague their ears like flies, in itself a striking image, Larkin suggests complex ideas about the human capacity for memory and reflection that the horses appear to lack. It's not surprising, perhaps, that a leading politician finds solace in this.
It's something of a plangent evensong at the end of the career, and I think actually that's what, for me, helps make the poem such an emotionally effective piece, because you have both that tremendous success in the high summer of his career and now a pleasant but dusky evening as it passes away.
At Grass is a poem about what you choose to see, and in that way it's also about memory, because memory is what we choose to bring up more and more sharply from this bath of the past. It's a very beautiful and seductive poem as well. You know, you're very drawn into this, to this sense of the dune and which he writes about so beautifully in Cut Grass, for example.
Cut grass lies frail, brief is the breath mown stalks exhale. Long, long the death, it dies in the white hours of young-leafed June, with chestnut flowers, with hedges snow-like strewn, white lilac bowed, lost lanes of Queen Anne's lace, and that high-builded cloud moving at summer's pace.
For the poet and critic Tom Paulin, Larkin's persistent theme is national decline. I phoned him at Hertford College, Oxford, to ask him what evidence of this he found in the poem.
One of the interesting things about this poem is that it seems to be about horses, but actually what you have in it is the idea of a diminished existence, and it's a diminished social existence. The imagery of silks at the start, and the parasols. He says 15 years ago, well, that would date it to 1935. It was first published in 1950, but really he's not thinking of that at all. He's thinking of before the First World War. Yes, sure, it's the Grand National, but it's as if the Grand National isn't so grand any longer, because these horses can't participate in it. They're past it. And so it is about that sense of diminishment which certain members of the post-war generation seem to have felt as gradually the empire started to break up, and the Commonwealth was substituted for it, and many countries became independent. It's partly a matter of mood, of low horizons, of diminishment, a diminishment after glory. Of course, there's no reference in it to empire whatsoever. But I do think that the groom and the groom's boy, and that slightly archaic final line, that brings in the idea of a sort of pastoral feudal society, which is increasingly out of date. That sort of rhetoric of diminishment is part of the climate of English modesty and reticence, I think. And what Larkin is very good at is creating a sort of atmosphere of both sort of diminishment and disillusion.
Andrew Motion agrees with this post-colonial analysis, but resists the implication that the poem is therefore nostalgic and conservative.
I think that Outgrass is a poem which is certainly about something that is gone, both at the local level of horses and a certain kind of society which surrounds them, but also, to take the larger point, about a moment in the life of the country they represent for the sake of the poem. I mean, there is, no question this is about a kind of late imperial moment, which a line is being drawn under. It's retired. It's not going to live for very much longer. Having said all that, if we then thought that Larkin was sort of merely nostalgic for it, we'd be misreading this poem in a very, very serious way. I mean, as I understand it, I have to say, these animals which have slipped their names and stand at ease, like a kind of decommissioned army, or gallop for what must be joy. Well, on one hand, the fact that not a field glass sees them home, not a curious stopwatch is prophesying this, might seem to contain an element of regret. Much more loudly, I hear relief, actually, excitement, pleasure. And I must say I hear that in a lot of Larkin's poems too. So this suit-wearing, respectability-courting figure actually is, in his quiet way, doing something much more complicated than that, which is to allow for the genuine grief that undoubtedly a genuinely large number of people genuinely felt about the ending of some things, but also to insinuate something about the opportunities that its overness, that its goneness allows succeeding generations to feel. So far from being a sort of purely straight-down-the-line conservative poem, it's actually a good deal more subversive than that.
It's a gathering-in poem. It's a harvesting poem where you gather from the past everything that is precious and you draw it back to yourself. And we have this wonderful image of the horse galloping. Larkin is often seen as a very, very gloomy poet, and certainly he had his fear of death, his terror of death and extinction informs so much of his poetry. But in this poem, there is a sense that although the past goes, that's not tragic. That there is a sense of accomplishment and achievement and fruition, and then the horse just goes off and gallops, and nobody knows why. Only the horse knows. It is a very joyful moment. So he manages to have an elegy which is not purely tragic at all.
At Grass ends enigmatically, as Larkin's poems so often do. The classic dunes, the silks and parasols are behind, but with their disappearance comes a comforting and consoling solitude. Whether we hear the poem as a naturalistic description of racehorses at rest, or as an elegy on the end of empire, it slips gently from summer sunshine to dusk to evening. Within the deepening shadows, it reaches for the possibility of happiness, for the possibility of peace. There's a poignancy in hearing Larkin himself reading it 30 years ago.
Do memories plague their ears like flies? They shake their heads. Dusk brims the shadows. Summer by summer all stole away, the starting gates, the crowds and cries, all but the unmolesting meadows. Almanacs their names live. They have slipped their names and stand at ease, or gallop for what must be joy. And not a field glass sees them home, or curious stopwatch prophesies. Only the groom and the groom's boy, with bridles in the evening come.
The Groom and the Groom's Boy with their bridle, read there by the poet himself, Philip Larkin. And as we'll recall early in the programme, Larkin's use of the bridle is technically wrong, but it's an acceptable misgiving. That was Adventures in Poetry, Philip Larkin, produced by Sarah Davis.